I was a project manager at a major tech company. Tight deadlines, constant stress, and barely any sleep. I'd be awake at all hours handling clients, fixing last-minute problems, and convincing myself it was all worth it because I was building a future for both of us. But I was wrong. One Friday, feeling drained, I decided to surprise her. I had been exhausted for weeks, and I figured a nice dinner could help us reconnect. Truthfully, I hadn't spent much quality time with her, and I wanted to change that. So, I left work early, grabbed her favorite meal from a local spot, and drove home, excited to see her reaction when I walked through the door. But that reaction never came. As I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was hushed voices from upstairs. My stomach clenched. I stood frozen in the doorway, still holding the food, my brain scrambling to make sense of it. I recognized that voice. I don't remember climbing the stairs. It felt like my body moved on its own. But when I pushed open the bedroom door, well, you can guess what I saw. I left immediately, drove for hours without any real destination, my mind racing, my grip on the steering wheel painfully tight. By morning, I walked into my boss's office and quit on the spot. No notice, no explanation. I just couldn't do it anymore. The job, the pressure, the life I had been living, it was too much. I needed to escape, to be alone. That's how I ended up renting a secluded cabin in the woods. It was remote, just what I needed, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to press in the deeper you went. The listing had described it as rustic and peaceful. But when I arrived, it felt different, weathered, almost eerie. The porch groaned under my weight as I stepped onto it, and the wooden planks creaked like they resented my presence. The cabin's exterior was faded and worn, and when I unlocked the door, I was greeted by a musty air, a mix of damp wood, decaying leaves, and something faintly metallic. Inside, the living room was small but cozy, with an old stone fireplace that looked untouched for years. The kitchen was neat but cramped, barely enough space for one person to move comfortably. The bedroom was tucked in the back, but it was the attic door in the hallway that caught my attention. The wood was old and faded, the hinges rusted, and the latch looked like it hadn't been disturbed in ages. I told myself I'd never go near it. I wasn't there to explore, I was there to forget. So I set down my bags, poured a stiff drink, and tried to relax. The first day, I hiked, breathing in the crisp air, finally feeling a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. That peace didn't last. That first night, exhausted, I had a quick meal, another drink, and stretched out on the couch. The silence of the forest was overwhelming after the constant hum of city life, but I reminded myself I needed to adjust. I was drifting off when I heard it, a dull thump from above. My groggy eyes opened and I listened, maybe just the cabin settling, or an animal on the roof. Then I heard it again. A raccoon, I assured myself, but something felt off. The sound wasn't random, it was deliberate. But there was no follow-up noise, so I let it go and fell asleep. The next day, I brushed it off as paranoia. But on the second night, I woke around 3 a.m. This time, it wasn't just a thump. It was footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate. And they weren't on the roof. They were in the attic. I lay there, frozen, listening to the slow pacing above me. My brain searched for a logical explanation, but none came. Just the wind. I whispered, but I didn't believe it. The following morning, I noticed something odd. My food was disappearing. At first, little things, a granola bar here, an apple there. I told myself I was just miscounting. But by the third day, half a loaf of bread was missing. Then the footsteps returned. By the fourth night, I was a wreck, running on no sleep, on edge at every tiny sound. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling when I heard it again. A thump, but this time it wasn't from above. It was in the hallway. I bolted upright, heart pounding. The fireplace poker I'd left by the hearth suddenly felt like my best friend. I gripped it tightly and crept toward the hallway, stepping carefully, barely making a sound. That's when I saw it. The attic door was open. My blood turned to ice. I stood there, staring at the gaping darkness beyond the hatch. The air felt thick, suffocating with an unnamed dread. I should have run. I should have grabbed my keys and left. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled the string for the attic light. A dim, flickering glow revealed old, forgotten junk. Rusting garden furniture, a broken umbrella. Then I saw it. A candy wrapper glinting under the light. I took another step up. More food scraps, my food. Then I heard something behind me. I turned. There, at the base of the attic steps, stood a man. His wide eyes were wild, his skin filthy and covered in sores. His clothes hung off him in ragged tatters. His matted hair framed a gaunt face, and his expression, he looked hungry. I barely managed to whisper, "Who the hell are you?" I raised the fire poker, ready to defend myself, but he just stared, unblinking. "Get out or I'm calling the police," I warned. That's when he moved. He lunged at me, faster than I thought possible. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding him, almost dropping the poker. He pivoted and sprinted into the kitchen. For a moment, I thought he was escaping. Then he reappeared, with a knife. I didn't wait. I ran. I tore out the front door, sprinting into the woods as if my life depended on it, because it probably did. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, his ragged breath growing closer. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop, couldn't. Branches whipped at my face. I tripped, stumbled, but kept going. Then I saw it, my car. I practically dove for it, fumbling with my keys, my hands trembling so badly I could barely unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked it, jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared, and I floored it, speeding down the dirt road. I didn't look back until I was miles away. I called the cops as soon as I had cell service. They searched the cabin, but the man was gone. All they found was a nest of filthy blankets and scraps of food in the attic. He had been living there, watching me. They never found him. To this day, I can't set foot in a remote cabin without feeling my skin crawl. And if you ever find yourself alone in one, please, for the love of God, check the attic. An old cabin, built many years ago, stands quietly in the woods. In the summer, it's peaceful and I can drive right up to the front door. But winter transforms everything. Snow blankets the narrow, twisting road, making it impossible to drive. I have to leave my car nearly a mile away and walk in, the cold biting at me with every step. The only sound is my own footsteps crunching through the snow, echoing between the trees. That's when the unease starts to creep in. Certain parts of the cabin feel wrong. It's not just the lingering cold that refuses to fade no matter how much I turn up the heat. It's something deeper, a chill that sinks into my bones. In those spaces, I always feel like I'm being watched, as though invisible eyes are following me, tracking my every movement. The worst part is at night when I'm lying in bed, trying to ignore the feeling. That's when I hear it. The doors. It's always the same. A soft creak as one of them moves. Sometimes, it's slow and deliberate, as if someone is trying to be careful. Other times, it's sharp and sudden, making my heart race. Every time, I force myself to check, convincing myself it's just my imagination. But when I look, everything is exactly how I left it. Doors closed, locked, nothing disturbed. But the worst thing, the noises from upstairs. The cabin has a loft overlooking the main room. I don't use it much. It's just storage now, filled with dusty furniture and boxes left behind by whoever lived here before. But lately, I've started dreading that space, because I hear footsteps. At first, I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or some other creature that had found a way in. But these aren't random scurrying sounds. They're deliberate, slow, heavy, human, a steady pacing back and forth, always late at night. The sound drifts down through the wooden beams, muffled just enough that I can never tell exactly where it's coming from. It's gotten so bad that I've started wearing headphones just to block it out. And then last week, everything changed. A loud thud, a sound so forceful it broke through the noise in my headphones. It was heavy, sickening, like something large had collapsed onto the floor upstairs. My dog, Jack, heard it too, and his reaction terrified me more than the noise itself. His ears flattened, his whole body stiffened, and his eyes locked onto the ceiling, wide with unblinking fear. He didn't growl, didn't whimper, just stood frozen, staring. It was as if he could see something I couldn't. "Jack," I whispered, but he didn't move. His muscles were tight, like he was about to run, but he stayed rooted to the spot. Nothing else followed. No more footsteps, no more creaks, just silence. I haven't told anyone about this. I know they'd just laugh it off, tell me I'm imagining things, but I know I'm not. A while ago, I tried researching the history of this place. I found out it used to be someone's home, maybe back in the 1950s, but beyond that, there's nothing. No records of who lived here, no details about what happened to them. It's like they disappeared. I've managed to ignore most of the strange occurrences, or at least pretend they weren't real. But after that night, I don't think I can keep doing that. Whatever is up there, whatever has been watching me, it's not stopping. It's getting bolder, and I don't think it's going away. Let me take you to a ranch deep in the Sonora wilderness, far from any town or trace of civilization. A friend had let us borrow a cabin, one of several simple lodgings owned by his relatives, so we could spend a weekend away from everything. The road leading there was rough, a winding trail of loose gravel that followed the bends of a dry riverbed. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, stretching long shadows across the rocky ground. The cabin itself was nothing luxurious, just 4 walls, a roof, and the basics to keep the cold air out. But at the back, there was a small wooden deck that overlooked the endless desert. That's where we settled in for the evening, talking and soaking in the eerie quiet of the open land, until we heard it. At first, it was faint, distant, almost easy to ignore. A low, dull thud followed by another, then another. It resembled the sound of a ball hitting the ground in a steady rhythm, bouncing faster and faster, as if something unseen was gaining momentum. But there was no ball, no wind, no movement in the desert, just that strange, pulsing sound. Then we felt it. A tremor, subtle but unmistakable, rose up through the wooden planks beneath our feet. It wasn't coming from the deck. It wasn't from the cabin. It was from below us, or worse, inside us. We exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke at first, but fear settled heavily over us. Trying to shake it off, I reasoned that maybe an old pipe or underground system was shifting with the temperature drop. Maybe there was even a buried structure beneath us, something reacting to the cooling air. But there was no heating system in the cabin, and no explanation really made sense. Determined to prove there was nothing to fear, we grabbed a flashlight and ventured beneath the house. The dry earth under the cabin was untouched. No pipes, no machinery, no sign of anything that could make a noise like that. Just silence. Then it happened again. The same thumping sound, the same accelerating beats, but this time they were louder. The vibrations surged through our bones. Panic gripped us. We didn't search any further. We bolted inside and locked the door. But the sounds didn't stop. They came in waves, starting faint, then building, pressing against the cabin walls and ceiling. We debated leaving, but the treacherous road was too dangerous to navigate in the dark. And somehow we knew this wasn't something we could escape just by driving away. One of my friends, a local, was visibly shaken. He finally broke the silence. "People say there are spirits here, or witches." No one laughed. No one brushed him off. The desert had always been a place of mysteries, and that night, it felt like we had intruded on something old and enraged. Through the small cabin window rolling across the empty land, we saw them, burning figures, balls of fire twisting and shifting unnaturally as they drifted across the desert. The locals called them witches. They flickered, contorted, and moved as if watching us. We couldn't think of anything else to do except shut the worn curtains and pretend we hadn't seen them. Sleep was impossible. Someone recalled stories their grandmother used to tell about such things. One of my friends pulled out a rosary and started praying. Somehow, it made the room feel less suffocating. The moment the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, we threw our bags in the car and sped away, cursing the decision to come in the first place. We never found a rational explanation for what we had experienced. But the friend who had lent us the cabin later admitted, strange things happen there from time to time. I only wish he had warned us, because that cabin isn't just a retreat. It's a trap for whatever lurks in that desert. While visiting a faraway country, we decided to rent a camper van to explore. That's exactly what we did. One thing I completely overlooked was the need to do laundry. Since we were traveling from quite a distance, we packed light, just one small suitcase for the two of us. This meant we had to wash our clothes pretty often. This was already our second time doing laundry, and I volunteered to handle it. The place we were staying for the night was a charming little cabin tucked into the woods. It had a few facilities, a swimming pool, a laundry room, and a small shop. I told my wife she could just relax with her book while I waited for the clothes. I had my handheld game console, so I was happy to pass the time while the laundry was running. One important thing to mention is that this place only had one washing machine and one dryer. I didn't want to risk someone grabbing the dryer before I could use it, so I decided to stay put. I loaded up the washer, fumbled with the coins, and sat down, enjoying my game while the machine hummed along. I was perfectly content. That's when I noticed something strange. Off to my right, I suddenly had the unsettling feeling that something was off. I turned and saw a man standing in the doorway of the laundry room. I looked up at him and said, "Hey, sorry, but the machine's in use. It'll be another 40 minutes. He gave a small nod but didn't say anything. I shrugged and went back to my game. But after a few moments, I realized I hadn't heard him leave. That was a little unnerving. I glanced back, and he was gone, just like that. I assumed he had walked off and didn't give it much more thought. When the wash cycle finished, I moved everything to the dryer, and once it was done, I gathered up the warm clothes into a basket and headed out. Just as I stepped through the door, pulling it shut behind me, I nearly jumped out of my skin. That same man was standing in the corner of the room, completely still. I had no idea he was there, and the shock nearly made me drop everything. I let out a startled yell and blurted, "Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there." But he just stood there. He didn't speak. He didn't even seem to breathe. I bent down to pick up my basket, and when I looked up again, he was gone. Not that he had walked away, just gone. One second he was there, and the next he wasn't. I wasn't sure how to process that in the moment, so I quickly gathered my things and hurried back to our cabin. I told my wife what had happened, but she brushed it off, saying I was probably just tired. The next morning, when we were checking out, the man at the front desk asked how our stay had been and where we were headed next. Just the usual friendly chat. Then my wife casually joked, "Tell your ghost to stop staring at people." She laughed, but I felt a little uneasy about her saying it. The desk clerk's face changed immediately. The whole mood shifted. "Ah," he said. "So you saw James then?" My wife and I exchanged confused looks. "Who's James?" We were missing some key information. The clerk explained that James had worked at the campground for years before passing away unexpectedly about a decade ago. Some people believed his spirit still lingered around the property. He wasn't known for scaring anyone, just being there. The owner himself had supposedly seen him, as had this very desk clerk. We shared an awkward laugh and left. As we walked away, my wife turned to me and said, "So I guess you weren't making it up after all," as if she had doubted me in the first place. After that, I never saw anything else strange. And honestly, I'd like to keep it that way. I was 14 years old when my family and I spent the summer at our lake house. The cabin was perched on a slope, overlooking a small lake with a wooden dock and 2 rowboats. Thick forests surrounded the property, so when you looked outside, all you could see were the hills rolling down to the water and a never-ending stretch of trees beyond it. One evening, around 9:30 p.m., my dad, sister, 3 cousins, their dad, and I decided to head down to the lake and start a fire. My grandparents and mom stayed back at the cabin, saying it was getting too late. We weren't planning anything extravagant, just sitting around the fire, watching the stars, and enjoying the peaceful night. We took my grandparents' dog and my cousin's dog along for company and made our way down the hill. The fire crackled to life, and for the first hour, everything was quiet and relaxing. We talked, laughed a little, and eventually settled into a comfortable silence. It wasn't awkward, just that nice, peaceful kind where everyone is content just being in the moment. That's when things started to feel off. At first, it was just a small, nagging feeling crawling up my spine, like we weren't alone. I tried to shake it off, assuming my mind was playing tricks on me, but the unease didn't fade. It got worse. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a deep sense of being watched settled over me. I was sitting with my back to the woods, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching us from the tree line. I was about to suggest we head back when my dad suddenly spoke up. "Yeah, I'm good," he said casually. Everyone turned to him, confused. We hadn't been talking. No one had asked him anything. My cousin, sitting closest to him, blinked. "What?" she asked, frowning. Dad looked around, just as confused as we were. "You asked how I was doing," he said, his brow furrowing. "No, I didn't," she replied. Silence. We all just stared at him. Then his face went pale. "I swear, I felt someone lean in and whisper in my ear," he said, his voice suddenly quieter. "They said, 'Hello, how are you?'" He swallowed hard. I felt their breath on my neck and a hand on my shoulder. His eyes flicked toward the cabin, like he was searching for something. Then he added, "I thought it was your mom, but when I turned around, there was no one there." That's when the dogs went wild. Both started growling, low, deep, and threatening. Their eyes locked onto the trees behind where my dad had been sitting. Their hackles rose, their bodies tense, ready to pounce on whatever was hiding in the darkness. That was all we needed. No one hesitated. We kicked dirt over the fire, grabbed our things, and ran up the hill, not daring to look back. My heart pounded as we sprinted toward the cabin. Once inside, we locked the doors and didn't speak for a long time. Even the dogs didn't settle down. They stayed by the door, ears perked, growling softly, like whatever had been out there was still lurking close by. We didn't go outside at night for the rest of the trip. Honestly, we never have since. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. I've replayed it in my mind countless times, trying to make sense of it. The only thing that comes close is something from Norwegian folklore, a creature known for playing tricks on people. But according to legend, they aren't exactly harmless. Some say they can lure people into the woods, never to return. Others say they cause misfortune if disrespected. Whatever my dad spoke to that night, I don't know if it meant well or not, and none of us are eager to ever find out. I've always been doubtful about anything supernatural, yet I enjoy reading, watching, and learning about it with an open mind. I think keeping an open mind helps a person grow. Whether this was paranormal or something else entirely is uncertain. Every summer, usually in mid-July, my friends and I would spend a few nights at Liam's family cabin, which is deep in the remote forests of central Alaska. For most of our childhood, Liam's father would accompany us, sometimes along with our own dads. By the time we reached our second year of high school, we felt old enough to take the trip without adult supervision. To help you picture the cabin, it's on a secluded island, surrounded by thick woods and only accessible by boat. We would park along a gravel road across the lake, then take a short boat ride, about half a mile, to reach the cabin. While there were other cabins on the island, the closest one was at least a quarter to a half mile away, only accessible by a narrow footpath through the woods. The cabin itself was small and simple, with a single floor containing 2 bedrooms, a combined living room and kitchen, and a bathroom at the back. Each room had at least one window, none with curtains, allowing a clear view of the dark woods and the lake. As a child, the open windows unsettled me, making me imagine someone staring in from the outside. But after years of visits without anything strange happening, I got used to it. That is, until that night. On the third night of our trip, we built a fire outside and drank a few beers we had secretly brought along. Sitting on the dock, we let the alcohol buzz settle in as we watched the stars. That's when we heard a splash out on the lake, like a fish leaping for food. Curious, we scanned the moonlit water. "What the hell is that?" Noah asked, pointing toward the lake. We followed his gaze and spotted what looked like a head floating on the surface about 75 yards away. It appeared to have long, dark hair and pale skin. The features were unclear, like a mask without eyes, nose, or mouth. A chill ran through me as fear gripped my body, making every hair stand on end. "Probably a loon," I muttered, trying to reassure myself as much as the others. Loons are common on lakes like this, diving underwater to fish. Still, this supposed head didn't move. It didn't make ripples. It just floated there, disturbingly still. Uneasy, we backed away from the dock and huddled closer to the fire, making the flames burn higher before heading inside for the night. Later, I stepped outside to relieve myself. I instinctively glanced at the lake and froze. The pale, hair-covered object had drifted closer. Now it was only 40 yards from the dock. The moonlight revealed more detail. A barely visible nose, the face tilted upward, as if it was watching the cabin. My pulse thundered. I bolted inside and woke the others. They rushed to the window. They saw it too. "It's just a log," Oliver said, but his voice lacked confidence. We clung to that explanation, despite knowing that logs don't drift against the current without ripples. They don't hold a position so deliberately. Hours later, the head was gone. We let out a shaky breath of relief and finally tried to sleep. Oliver and I slept in the living room, while Liam and Noah took the bedrooms. The windows remained open to let the summer air flow through. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps crunching in the dirt near the fire pit. Then, the sound of boots lightly tapping against the wooden dock. My breath hitched as the footsteps approached the cabin stairs. One step creaked, then another, then silence. Moments later, the steps retreated, this time running, crashing through the woods along the narrow path. "Noah," I whispered, "did you hear that?" His wide eyes answered before his trembling voice did. "Yeah." Suddenly, Liam's bedroom door flew open. He looked pale, panicked. "We need to get out of here. Now." I asked him why. His voice shook as he explained that he had turned over in bed and saw someone watching him through the window. A face pressed into the top right corner. Pale skin, long, black hair, a single staring eye. That's when realization hit us. The top corner of the window was nearly 8 feet off the ground. Either this thing was standing on something or it was impossibly tall. Panic took over. We threw our essentials into our bags, leaving the cabin a mess as we rushed outside. That's when we noticed them, bare footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin, leading toward the trees. We sprinted to the boat, untied it with shaking hands, and sped across the lake, none of us daring to look back. Once we reached the car, we drove in silence, gripping the wheel in white-knuckled fear. Finally, Noah broke down, his voice cracking. "What the hell did I see?" The following weekend, Liam's dad returned to the cabin. He found nothing out of the ordinary, except for the same barefoot tracks circling the property. We never figured out what we encountered that night. None of us ever went back. Not the next summer, not ever. Maybe it was an elaborate prank. Maybe it was something worse. But whatever it was, something watched us that night. Something tall. Something with ghostly pale skin and hair dark as the water beneath it. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. So, my grandmother owns this old cabin in a small remote town in southern Chile. It's been in our family for 3 generations, but originally, it was built by early settlers who first claimed the land. My ancestors purchased it a long time ago, and it's been ours ever since. Every year, we make a trip out there to visit. It's a beautiful place, surrounded by thick woods, with mountains visible in the distance, and it's completely quiet and peaceful. But there has always been something off about it. For starters, the cabin is ancient and falling apart in certain spots. Some rooms stay freezing cold even when there's a fire going. We always assumed it was just the house settling or poor insulation, but over time, the strange occurrences started to pile up. One night, my cousin was heading up to the attic when he suddenly froze. He swore he heard whispering from above, soft, like people having a hushed conversation. He panicked and ran back downstairs, looking pale as a sheet. We checked, but of course, the attic was empty except for the usual old boxes and furniture. And it wasn't just him. Several of us have heard footsteps upstairs when no one's supposed to be there. Heavy, deliberate steps like someone pacing back and forth. But every time we go to check, the room is completely still. Then there was the time my aunt was on a video call with my mom. They were talking like usual when my aunt suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her face going blank. "Who's behind you?" she asked. My mom turned, but there was no one there. My aunt swore she saw a dark figure standing in the doorway behind her. Another time, my cousin was on a video call while staying at the cabin, and he actually caught something weird. The audio started glitching, like heavy breathing near the microphone, and for a second, a shadowy shape flickered across the screen. We replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. It's not just noises and strange visuals either. Objects move on their own. Keys left on the table end up in a different room. Cups shift positions overnight. The lights flicker randomly, even though we've had the wiring checked over and over again. But the worst part is the feeling of being watched. It's strongest near the attic stairs, right where my cousin heard the whispering. If you stand there alone at night, it feels like someone is just out of sight, staring at you. It's an awful, skin-crawling sensation. And yet, despite all of this, we keep going back. It's our family's place, after all. But at this point, I'm convinced we're not the only ones still living there. We haven't done anything about it, though. We're not the type to bring in a priest or anything, and honestly, nothing has ever hurt us. So, I guess we're just going to live with it. But even so, it's still very unsettling. I've never been one to believe in ghosts. Even now, I try to convince myself there must be a logical reason for what happened. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the memories come creeping back, I can't help but wonder. 16 years ago, I arrived in Vietnam as part of a teaching program, eager to teach English and experience life in a new country. I was assigned to a small town just outside of Ho Chi Minh City, where narrow streets were lined with mango trees, and the air carried the scent of incense and sizzling street food. My home was a modest wooden house, its walls worn with age. It wasn't much, but it was where I lived. It happened to be right across from an ancient Buddhist monastery. In the daylight, its golden rooftops shimmered under the sun, a stunning sight. But at night, the atmosphere shifted. The graveyard next to it, with mossy stone markers and dimly flickering lanterns, seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't quite explain. I told myself it was all in my head, just the effect of being in an unfamiliar place steeped in history. Then the lights started acting up. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find them flickering on and off as if someone was playing with the switch. At first, I assumed it was just old wiring. After all, the house was aging. But then the television started doing it too. It would turn on by itself, the screen filled with harsh static at full volume. I always kept the volume low when I watched it, so the first time it happened, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The deafening noise and the eerie blue glow threw strange shadows across the room. I turned it off only for it to happen again. Eventually, I just unplugged it. I told myself it was the humidity affecting the circuits, or maybe the town's unstable power grid, but deep down, something felt off. One day, while wandering the neighborhood, I met an elderly woman I'll call Lynn. She quickly took me under her wing, her kindness easing my transition into Vietnamese life. She brought me fresh fruit and flowers from the market, showed me where to find the best street food, and even taught me a few phrases in the local language. There was a warmth about her, like a grandmother watching over me. One afternoon, as we sipped tea on her porch, she made an offhand remark that still gives me chills. You know, this area has many spirits. They wander the temple grounds, especially your house. She paused and looked at me closely. I see them sometimes. They are not at peace. I let out a nervous chuckle, trying to dismiss it. Oh, it's probably just the old house playing tricks on me, I said, but she didn't laugh. She only gave a slow, knowing nod. That night, the disturbances happened again. I woke up to the sound of static blaring from the living room, a flickering glow seeping under my bedroom door. My heart pounded as I stumbled out of bed, hands shaking as I reached for the switch. And then I shouted, "Stop!" in Vietnamese, and it did. The TV went silent. The lights steadied. A deep stillness settled over the room. My mind raced, grasping for an explanation. It had to be a coincidence, right? There had to be a reason for it. But no matter how much I tried to reason it away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had listened to me. After that, I started staying away from the house as much as possible. I spent extra hours at school grading assignments or preparing lessons. I visited Lynn often. She never mentioned the spirits again, but sometimes I'd catch her stealing a worried glance at my home. When my time in Vietnam ended, I was more than ready to leave. I packed my bags, said my goodbyes, and never looked back. Yet even now, all these years later, I still think about that place. I tell myself it was just faulty wiring or my nerves adjusting to a foreign country. But when the night is quiet and I find myself staring at the ceiling, I wonder if the spirits are still there, drifting through the temple grounds, waiting for the next unsuspecting tenant to arrive. Back in junior high, we had a weekend school trip to a campground. The class was divided into two cabins, one for the boys and one for the girls. The setup of the girls' cabin was simple. Stepping inside through the front door, you entered an open main area. To the left, there were two sets of bunk beds with a single bed position between them. On the right, there was a small, closed-off room where the teachers stayed. Past that were the bathrooms, while a long room extended to the left, lined with 2 rows of additional bunk beds. Most of the girls crammed into the back room, but my group of friends was lucky enough to claim the bunks in the open main area. I picked a bottom bunk, which seemed like a smart choice at the time. The first night was exactly what you'd expect. Staying up way too late, whispering, laughing, and joking around until we all eventually dozed off. Nothing strange, but the second night, that was different. We were asleep by midnight, exhausted from a long day of outdoor activities. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. It was that strange kind of waking where you're still groggy, not fully aware. I fumbled under my pillow for my flip phone and flipped it open. The time read 2:07 a.m. I sighed, thinking I had just woken up for no reason and needed to shift positions. I sat up slightly, stretched, and started rolling over, moving away from the wall so I could face the open room. But just as I was almost fully turned, I froze. Someone was standing in the middle of the cabin. A boy. He was pale, with short, light-colored hair and wearing a simple t-shirt and shorts, the kind of outfit any kid at camp might have worn. But something was wrong. Even in the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the windows between the bunks, I could tell. He had no eyes, just 2 dark, empty hollows where they should have been. And yet, somehow he was staring right at me. I felt it. His gaze locked onto mine. Unmoving, hollow, and deeply unsettling. I couldn't move. I just lay there, frozen, staring back at him. It felt like an eternity, though in reality, it was probably no more than 15 seconds. Just enough time for my pulse to hammer in my ears, for my skin to go ice cold. I kept a small flashlight next to my phone on the bed. Slowly, never breaking eye contact, I reached for it. My fingers brushed against the cool plastic. My breath was shallow, heart pounding as I carefully lifted it with shaky hands. Click. The flashlight beam flooded the room. The boy was gone. There was nothing there, just the quiet hum of the night and the faint rustling of leaves outside. I let out a shaky breath, only then realizing I had been holding it the whole time. I flicked the flashlight off quickly, not wanting to wake anyone, and that's when I heard it. A soft voice from the bunk above mine. "You saw him too?" My heart nearly stopped. It was my friend. She had seen him as well. "Yeah," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. Neither of us spoke after that. I turned back over, this time facing the wall, pulling my blanket up tight. My mind raced, my pulse still pounding. I lay there for what felt like forever before exhaustion finally took over. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep, but I did. Thankfully, that was our last night there. We left the next morning, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I never saw that boy again, but I will never forget those hollow eyes. And knowing I wasn't the only one who saw him,